In this video we're going to take a look at our interval of a fifth in a little bit more detail. So you'll remember that we called an interval a fifth when counting the bottom note and the top note we used 5 different letter names to make that journey. So you'll see here if we started on this C, which sounds like this, and we ended up on this G, which sounds like this, we have to take 5 steps through different letter names to go from the bottom note to the top note. C is 1, D is 2, E is 3, F is 4, and 5 is G. And that's what gives us this interval of a fifth. We also said that if we move that pattern around, keeping the distance the same, we should end up with something that sounds quite similar. So we said that this fifth here, these fifths, have a very similar quality to these fifths here, between F and C. So if we were to count our way up from F to C, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, again we get that relationship. Let's have a listen to a few more. Here's E and B, and here is A and E. And so the pattern's the same. No matter where we move it on the keyboard, we're trying to get 5 notes from our bottom note to our top note. Now what happens when we play B and F? So here's a B and here's an F. Let's play them together. You notice that this sounds a little bit different. This isn't the same kind of very bare, open sounding fifth that we had before. This is something else. So we're going to have to maybe ask ourselves a few questions as to what's going on here and why does it sound different. Actually, when I taught you about fifths, I left out an important bit of information that actually there's a few different types of fifth interval. So we're looking at fifth interval. And I'm now going to tell you that there's actually 3 types of fifth interval, and it just depends on how big or small in terms of semitones that interval actually is if we count it up on our piano keyboard. And something stays the same. So for something to be a fifth, what I said at the beginning was actually true, that we're going to use 5 different letter names to go from the bottom to the top. And if you look at the one that didn't quite fit, this strange one, where we went from B to F, we actually did the same thing that we'd done on all the other fifths. We went through a pattern of 5 notes, so B, C, D, E, and F. But there's something distinctly different if we listen to B and F together than if we listen to C and G together. I hope you'll be able to hear that sound something slightly different. This sounds more murky and mysterious and a bit more sinister, and I think the other fifths, the C and G fifths, sound more open. So there's something a bit interesting here, and we'll need to delve down a little bit below the surface to try and work out what's going on. Let's try and count the number of semitones between B and F. So to go from B to F, we need to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 semitones up from B. So in counting in semitones, this interval between B and F is 6 semitones. Let's try the same thing between C and G. Here's our C, here's our G. And take that path up, counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Aha! So there is something different going on here. So between C and G, there are actually 7 semitones. And herein is the ultimate difference between these 2 pairs of notes. You'll see that there's a different distance between the bottom and top note in terms of semitones, even though ultimately they use the same number of letter names. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 between B and F, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 between C and G. So what's going on here? Well, actually what we've discovered here is 2 different types of fifth interval. The one that I played you first and in the last lesson was something called a perfect fifth. And it sounds like that. It's that open, bare sound. So we call that something like C to G, A to E, these are just some examples, and D to A is something called a perfect fifth. Just use a number here. A perfect fifth. So when someone says to you, I want you to play some fifths, this is probably the one they mean. They actually mean the perfect fifth, because otherwise they would give you the full name of one of the other types of fifths that we might come across. And as we worked out before, the distance in semitones between the bottom note and the top note, or even the top note and the bottom note in a perfect fifth, is 7 semitones. So if you're ever in doubt as to whether you're dealing with a perfect fifth or something else, you just need to count the distance, the journey you have to take from the bottom note to the top note of the pair, and if you count to 7, you're dealing with a perfect fifth, and that will always be the case. Now, if we try the other type of fifth that we discovered, for example, this one, B to F, and actually B to F is the only one, or F to B, you can always do intervals in both directions. It's the only one not using any of the black notes that we can make of this other type of fifth. You'll also remember that to get from the bottom note to the top note in this other type of fifth that we were looking at just before, we needed to count up 6 semitones instead of 7. So let's try that. Here's our C to start on, then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And you'll see there that we end up on a G flat. Now there's a reason why I'm calling it a G flat and not an F sharp, which I will go into in a moment. So there's C to G flat, and let's just get another one just for a useful comparison. So here's our E. Let's count up 6 semitones from the E. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and we end up on B flat. So E to B flat also gives us this different type of fifth that has a different sound. Let's have a listen to a few of those. So there's our C and G flat. There's E and B flat. And here's B and F. All of those giving us this slightly different character, and the name for this new type of fifth is a diminished fifth. And as we worked out before, we need to go on a journey of 6 semitones to go from the bottom note to the top note of that interval, or the other way around. We count down 6 semitones to go from the top note to the bottom note of a diminished fifth interval. And you can do that anywhere on the keyboard, and you'll get that same slightly more mysterious, slightly more harsh sounding interval. Turns out that this is quite a famous interval in the history of music, because back in history, it was thought that this interval had a very sinister and evil quality to it. It was actually called the devil in music, which you might come back to in a future video, but it was always taught to composers that you should try and avoid this interval if you're trying to make beautiful music, because this was where the devil hung out in music. And I know a lot of composers have made huge use of that interval to that kind of sinister and evil effect in music they've been writing. There is actually one more type of fifth interval which we could look at in this video, just to complete our collection of fifth intervals, and it does something slightly different. So if we look here, you'll notice that we had flats coming in here. We had a G flat and a B flat, and you might be thinking, well, what if we make this 1 semitone bigger than the perfect fifth? So this is 1 semitone smaller. C to G is normally a perfect fifth, and we've made it 1 smaller here to make it into a diminished fifth. When something diminishes, it gets a little bit smaller, and that's what we've done with this interval. We've taken our interval of 7 semitones, and we've made it 1 semitone smaller to make it one of 6 semitones. So what happens if we make it 1 larger and go from C to G sharp? Well, we get something called an augmented fifth. And just the way that diminished means getting slightly smaller, augmented means getting slightly bigger. And the reason it's augmented is it now has 8 semitones between the bottom note and the top note. And just to prove that to you, let's go on a journey from C to G sharp, counting as we go. So here's our first semitone, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth. We put those together, and they sound like that, a different sound again. And just to finish off, I'm going to write you some more augmented fifth intervals. So it's an augmented fifth between F and C sharp, and G and D sharp. Now you might be asking the question, why are these sharps and not flats? Well, the answer to that is, essentially, as soon as we stop using letter names that are 5 notes apart, it stops being a fifth and it starts to be something else. And that's something to really take a good note of at this point, and really remember that when we're dealing with intervals, so important are the letter names of the bottom and top notes. So say we were to take this interval and change it so that it was C to F sharp, well, it stops being a fifth then, because we've gone through only 4 letter names to go from the bottom to the top. You'll probably be able to work out what this would be. This would be some kind of fourth, because we've only used 4 letter names to go from the bottom note to the top note. So let's have a look at fourths in a little bit more detail.